Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 1. Here goes the question. Communalism was not so much a Muslim reaction to Hindu dominance as the Muslim League's counter to political hegemony of the Indian National Congress. Elucidate. We hope that you can make out the meaning of the question, but even before we start attempting the question, we have to basically define communalism. What communalism is? While there are, you could say, varying definition of communalism, varying understanding of communalism, there is a wide consensus that communalism is politicization of sectarian differences. That is, communalism is essentially weaponizing the sectarian difference among the communities and to use it, that is the sectarian differences, the sense of, you could say, grievances as a political weapon. We would repeat it. Communalism is the politicization of sectarian differences among the communities. With this, actually, it's quite difficult to pinpoint the exact origin of communalism in India. No one is quite sure at which point communalism emerged, or in fact, where there was always a sense of, you could say, communal grievances, sectarian grievances that you could say took the form of communalism at certain point of time. Anyway, the point is, pinpointing the exact cause of communalism in India is an exercise fraught with. That is, it's quite difficult exercise. Communalism was certainly an expression of historical grievances in a climate of colonialism, where the rulers took the recourse of divide et impera, that is, divide and rule, to weaken the liberation movement. The point is, there must have been, you could say, historical grievances among the communities, among the both Hindus as well as the Muslims, and in fact the other communities as well. There were always some historical grievances, but these grievances were sought to be exploited by the British colonial government, because you can understand it very well. If had it been successful in exploiting these grievances, it would have turned into, you could say, division of the national movement, and the communities could not come together and pose a challenge to the British colonial government. It is a historical fact that a sense of communal divide had taken roots before the founding of both Congress, that is 1885, and Muslim League 1906. And certainly it's not also the point that communalism emerged with the founding of Congress, or for that matter League. It was even before these two events. The religious reform movements, as we have so many times talked about, that one of the, you could say, perverse results of the religious movements, religious reform movements, was the, you could say, taking root of communalism in India. The religious reform movements among both Hindus and Muslims had perversely taken positions that fueled sectarianism. The Hindu reformer harkened back to the supposedly pre-Islamic Hindu golden age, which by implication came to end only because of Muslim invasion. The Muslims took a restorative stance, looking longingly at Muslim rule period, and essentially they sought to restore the Muslim rule. This restorationist divide sowed suspicion in both the communities. The revivalist tendencies among the Hindus and the restorationist tendencies, the restorationist agenda of the Muslim, you could say, reformers. And you can give specific examples of revivalist tendencies among the Hindus. An obvious example would be Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj had taken a revivalist stance. On the other hand, among the Muslims, the Wahhabis had a had an explicitly restorative agenda, that they wanted to reimpose the Muslim rule over Hindus. That was their position actually. However, an explicitly divisive stance was adopted by colonial administration as it saw the national movement gaining strength. It saw that the national movement was, you could say, growing in strength, and so it tried to weaken the national movement by, you could say, dividing the country along along communal lines. Not just content with dividing Indians along races, Census Commissioner H. Risley, he came up with the scheme of Partition of Bengal, the epicenter of nationalist movement along religious lines. You can understand very, very well that it was the British scheme, the British, you could say, conspiracy to divide Bengal along the communal lines among the Muslim majority and the Hindu majority, you could say, areas. And the point is, it was always schemed at weakening the national movement, which was, you could say, most powerful, which had gathered most pace in Bengal. You can also recall Risley's infamous statement that Bengal united is a power and Bengal divided would go go to its different ways, and the national movement would be weakened. So was the implication. In 1906, British rulers facilitated the founding of Muslim League. So the Muslim League was founded in the year 1906, around the same time as the Partition of Bengal. Popular protests against Partition of Bengal forced the British to abandon partitioning Bengal. That is, we are talking of the annulment of Partition of Bengal along the sectarian lines. Instead, opting for linguistic criteria and administrative convenience. It happened around 1911. That it was in 1911 that the Partition of Bengal was annulled, and the alternative was dividing Bengal along linguistic lines. That is, among the Hindi-speaking as well as Odia-speaking state and a Bangla-speaking province. This victory for nationalist ideology, spearheaded by Congress, was deliberately interpreted as defeat of Muslim aspirations for a Muslim-dominated polity. The point is, the Muslims were always hoping for a Muslim-dominated polity, a Muslim-dominated province in parts of Bengal. But when the scheme of Partition of Bengal was annulled, it was interpreted, it was actually signaled to the Muslims that it was a, you could say, a big setback to their aspirations for a Muslim majority province. So, what was the Muslim League's communal counter to Congress? How it sought to counter the Congress adopting a communal line? First, we have already talked about Partition of Bengal. It was defeat of communal criterion. Congress and in fact other, you could say, elements who were involved in protest against the Bengal partition, they ensured that the Partition of Bengal along communal lines would be defeated. Instead, the criterion that would be fixed for partitioning Bengal was linguistic criteria as well as administrative convenience. We can also give the example of Khilafat movement. In the Khilafat movement, through the Khilafat movement, the Congress demonstrated that it was ready to take Muslim issues. So you can understand very, very well that it would mean that the Congress was a contender, a competitor even for Muslim votes. That was obviously a signal to the Muslim League that they could not counter Congress with a specific Muslim agenda. Separate electorate versus safeguards for minorities. The Muslim League actually demanded a separate electorate where seats would be reserved for Muslims and from where only the Muslims could vote, that the electorate too would be Muslims. Instead, to counter it, the Congress came up with reservation that, for the Muslims among the common seats. That is, there would be seats that would be reserved only for Muslims, from where only Muslims could contest, but the voters would be, you could say, joint electorate. That is, both Hindus and Muslims could vote from those, you could say, constituencies. Then coming to the specific point of 1937 provincial elections under the Government of India Act of 1935, the Congress demonstrated that it had support among Muslims as well. In many provinces, the Muslims had indeed voted for Congress. Again, despite, you could say, despite the fact that in Uttar Pradesh, that is those days, the United Provinces, a majority of Muslims voted for Muslim League. In many other provinces, the Muslims indeed had voted for Congress. Elaborating on these points, we have already talked about the partition of Bengal and how it was a supposed setback for the aspiration of Muslims. The Khilafat movement of 1919 saw Congress and Muslim League collaborate. You are well aware that the Congress and Muslim League had came together during the Lucknow Pact, and they sought to, you could say, mount a united challenge during the Khilafat movement. But it also demonstrated to everyone that Congress was not averse to taking up issues specific to Muslims, putting paid to League's charge of Congress being a Hindu party. So here not only Muslim League's charge against Congress being a Hindu party was defeated, but in fact Congress was coming up as a competitor for Muslim votes too, because it was ready, it was always, you could say, it always agreed to take up Muslim specific issues too. While we are here, we must point out that many scholars have condemned the Congress tendency of taking a communal specific, you could say, issue, that is the Khilafat movement. The Khilafat movement was specific to the Muslims, and many people, many scholars actually, you could say, criticize the Congress tendency of, you could say, appeasing to Muslim, you could say, sentiments through the Khilafat movement, even while Congress was a secular party. Congress and League differed on the issue of separate electorate, which was, as you know probably, introduced by the Molay-Minto reforms of 1909 and the Government of India Act of 1909. The League demanded seats from which only Muslims could contest and vote. Congress countered with joint electorate, where both communities could vote, but seats were reserved for Muslims. The League had its way on separate electorate, but could not capitalize on this opportunity, as its dismal record, that is the League's dismal record on Muslim seats before 1945 shows. While there were indeed cases for, you could say, separate electorate for Muslims, but the Muslim League did not perform as well on the Muslim dominated seats, on the Muslim reserved seats. In fact, its performance was quite miserable. The 1937 elections to provincial legislature came as a shock to League. Congress decimated League. Its allies and moderate Muslims ensured League could secure barely 1/4 of the Muslim seats. The shock of the 1937 defeat was the trigger for League amping up its communal agenda, culminating in the tragedy of partition. The point is, the 1937 electoral defeat came as a shock for the League, which sought to adopt a quite extremist communal line, which ultimately culminated in the partition of India in 1947. The conclusion is, sectarian tensions existed before Congress and League. Obviously, the point is, we cannot blame either the Congress and League for sectarian tensions, but League sought to counter Congress' big tent politics that had place for Muslims, as well as by adopting a communal agenda exploiting fears of majority domination. When we talk of big tent politics, what it means, sometimes a party takes this position that it has a big tent where everyone is welcome, where it does not appeal to, you could say, a specific, you could say, sectors, specific segments actually, but rather it says that it would be able to take up the agenda that would be for everyone, where every segment of the society could come under its tent. That is the classic big tent politics. So Congress was essentially signaling to Muslims that under its big tent, both Hindus, Muslims, and other communities could come up. But as you can see, that the League sought to counter this big tent politics with its extremely communal agenda. That was all on the Congress League, you could say, political differences, and how leagues appeal to communalism. The League's, you could say, transition to communalism was essentially a counter to the Congress hegemony. This was all for today. We would reassemble for the next lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.